The truth always comes out in the end. My parents thought they could break me with their words, but what they didn't know was that they had underestimated my strength. The day I stood up for myself was the day their world crumbled. It had been weeks since I had stopped helping my parents. The phone calls had slowed down, but the pressure in their voices was undeniable. They were starting to feel the weight of their situation, and as much as it pained me to hear their desperation, I knew it was necessary. They had to understand what it felt like to face the consequences of their actions. I couldn't keep rescuing them, no matter how much they begged or how much guilt they tried to throw on me. But as the days dragged on, I could sense the tension mounting. I knew they were struggling. I knew they were scared. And in some small, twisted part of me, I felt satisfaction. Not because I wanted to see them suffer, but because it was the only way for them to finally understand the price of their words, the price of their lack of faith in me. They had dismissed me, belittled my family, and now they would face the truth. It all came to a head one afternoon when I received a call from my mother. Her voice was shaky, and there was an undeniable crack in her tone. "Sweetheart, we need your help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I hadn't spoken to them in a week, but I had been expecting this call. The bills were piling up. The utilities had been cut off, and I knew they were running out of time, but still I couldn't help them. Not after everything they had said to me. Not after they had turned their backs on me and my baby. "I can't help you, Mom," I replied, my voice firm. "I've told you before, I'm not your safety net anymore." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing heavily, struggling to hold herself together. But I couldn't let her break me. I had already made my decision. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "We've always been there for you, always. We've given you everything, and now when we need you, you turn your back on us?" Her words stung. I had always felt guilty for not being able to repay them for everything they had done for me over the years, but guilt wasn't enough anymore. They had crossed a line, and I needed them to understand that they couldn't take me for granted. "Not anymore. I've always been there for you too," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "But when you called my baby a burden, you crossed a line. You don't get to have it both ways. You can't treat me and my family like this and expect me to just keep giving." There was another long pause. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on both of us. And then, slowly, my mother spoke again. "Do you hate us, sweetheart?" Her question shattered me in a way I hadn't expected. Did I hate them? No, I didn't hate them, but I was hurt. And I was angry. I was angry that they had made me feel like I wasn't good enough, that they had undermined my ability to be a good mother, and that they had called my child a burden, when they didn't understand what it took to raise a family. "No, Mom," I replied softly. "I don't hate you, but I can't keep enabling you. I've been doing everything for you for so long, and I've never once asked for anything in return. But you don't get to call my baby a burden and then expect me to keep saving you." She didn't say anything after that. The silence between us was deafening, but I knew I had said everything that needed to be said. I had made my stance clear. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me any longer. I wasn't going to be their emotional punching bag or their financial crutch. If they wanted to fix their lives, they would have to do it on their own. The following days were filled with tension. I kept waiting for them to call again, to beg for my help, but they didn't. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I wasn't being dragged down by their endless demands. I wasn't living under their shadow anymore. I was free, but then, about a week later, I got a call from my father. His voice was low and calm, and I could hear the strain in his words. "We need to talk," he said. I agreed to meet him the following day. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew this would be the moment when everything came to a head. This would be when they realized just how far they had pushed me and how much they had underestimated my resolve. When I arrived at their house, I found my father sitting in the living room, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. There was no sign of my mother. She was probably avoiding the conversation, too afraid to face me after everything that had happened. I took a deep breath and sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with unspoken words. With all the hurt and resentment that had built up over the past few months, finally my father spoke. I want to apologize, he said, his voice low. I know I hurt you. I was wrong to call your baby a burden. I was angry and I didn't mean it, I'm sorry. I blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For the first time in a long time, my father sounded like the man I had grown up with, the man who had always known how to fix things, how to make everything right. But this time, it wasn't enough. I appreciate your apology, Dad, I said, trying to keep my emotions in check. But it's not just about the words you said. It's about everything. It's about how you and Mom have treated me. I've been carrying your weight for so long without asking for anything in return. And when I needed you, when I needed your support, you turned your backs on me. His eyes filled with regret, but I didn't back down. I've been the one who's always been there, quietly paying your bills, covering your expenses, helping you when you needed it. And yet, you still think it's okay to treat me like I'm the one who's failing. You've never once acknowledged what I've done for you. I stood up, my heart pounding. I'm not going to keep doing this. I can't keep giving to you when you don't even see me. I've been invisible to you for so long, Dad, and I've had enough. His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I saw the man I used to know, the man who had been my rock, my protector. But it was too late. The damage had been done. I didn't realize how much you were carrying, he said quietly. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. I looked at him, my heart heavy but resolute. The truth is, Dad, you didn't realize because you never bothered to look. You never saw me, not truly. And now you're going to have to learn to stand on your own. I can't keep fixing things for you. I've spent my whole life fixing everyone else's messes. It's time I started living for myself. I turned to leave, but before I could walk out, my father called out to me. Please don't go like this. Please don't let this break us. I stopped in my tracks, my hand on the doorknob. For a brief moment, I thought about going back, about forgiving them and going back to the way things were. But then I remembered all the years of silent sacrifice, all the times I'd been invisible, all the times my family had overlooked my needs. No, Dad, I said, my voice steady. I'm not going back. I need to find my own path now. And so do you. With that, I walked out of their house, my heart heavy but free. The weeks that followed were a slow but steady process of healing. My parents continued to struggle, but they eventually found their footing. They realized that without me there to bail them out, they had to take responsibility for their own lives. Slowly, they began to rebuild, and as hard as it was to watch them struggle, I knew it was necessary. They had to face the consequences of their actions. And as for me, I learned something powerful in that moment. I learned that it was okay to walk away, to stop carrying the weight of others when it was breaking me. I learned that family doesn't always mean unquestioning sacrifice. Sometimes it means standing up for yourself, even when it's hard, even when it feels like you're walking away from everything you've ever known. They say family is everything, but what happens when the ones you've always loved and trusted betray you in the worst way? When my parents called my baby a burden, I had no choice but to show them just how wrong they were. But what they didn't. No, I had been quietly paying their bills for months, and now the tables are about to turn. Growing up, I always believed my family was the cornerstone of my world. My parents were my heroes. I idolized them. They taught me how to walk, how to talk, how to live with integrity. They gave me everything I needed: love, guidance, and a roof over my head. I thought we had a bond that was unbreakable, that nothing could tear us apart. But when I had my baby, something shifted. It wasn't immediate. At first, everything seemed fine. They were excited about their first grandchild. But as the months went by, something changed, and not for the better. When I first told them I was pregnant, Their faces lit up with joy. They told me how proud they were, how they couldn't wait to hold their grandbaby. There were moments of excitement where we sat around imagining the future, talking about all the milestones, the birthdays, the holidays. For a short while, it felt like we were a family again, united in our excitement for the new addition to our lives, but that happiness was fleeting. As my pregnancy progressed, their excitement waned, and I started noticing the subtle signs that something was off. At family gatherings, my mother would make remarks about how difficult babies were, about how my life would change in ways I couldn't even imagine. It wasn't advice, it was judgment. And it wasn't long before I began to feel that they were looking at me differently. I tried to brush it off. After all, this was just the stress of becoming grandparents, right? But no, the comments became more frequent, more cutting. It felt as though they were expecting me to fail as a parent, before I even had the chance to try. When my baby was born, instead of the usual celebration, there was an awkwardness in the air. They came to visit, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. They weren't interested in holding the baby, playing with him, or being involved in his life. And then it happened. The moment that would forever change everything. It was a quiet evening at their house. We were sitting in the living room, me, my husband, my parents, and my baby. There was no music, no laughter, just the sound of a clock ticking. The atmosphere was suffocating. Out of nowhere, my father, who had been quietly sipping his drink, looked up and said, "You really think you're going to be able to handle this? That baby, he's just a burden. You're going to be broke, tired, and alone before you know it." I froze. His words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, choking the room. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. My own father had just called my child a burden. My chest tightened, and I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let him see my weakness. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a smile. "A burden?" I managed to choke out. "He's not a burden, he's my son. He's everything to me." My mother chimed in, her voice cold and distant. "Don't you think you're going to struggle? You can't even manage your own life. How are you going to manage his?" The words pierced me deeper than any wound could. They didn't just criticize my baby. They attacked me, my ability to care for my child, and my very worth as a mother. It wasn't just a passing comment. It was the culmination of months of subtle jabs, and in that moment, everything I'd once believed about my parents came crashing down. The people I had loved, respected, and turned to for guidance had turned on me. They didn't just see my baby as a burden, they saw me as incapable, weak, and unworthy of their support. The pain wasn't just in their words, it was in the realization that my parents, the people who were supposed to love and uplift me, didn't believe in me. And that hurt more than anything else. But as I sat there trying to collect myself, something inside me began to shift. The hurt turned into something else, something colder, more calculated. I realized that I wasn't alone in this situation. I had been carrying their weight for months, quietly and without them knowing. I had been paying their bills, covering their debts, keeping their lives afloat while they criticized me. What they didn't know was that I had been secretly supporting them financially. I had been paying their mortgage, covering their utility bills, and even handling their medical expenses. They never asked for help, but I knew they were struggling. So, without their knowledge, I'd been transferring money to their accounts, making sure they didn't have to face the consequences of their own mistakes. Every month when the bills came in, I took care of them. When they couldn't afford their medications or the bills started to pile up, I was there, quietly solving their problems without asking for anything in return. But now, here they were, calling my child a burden, as if they had never taken a single penny from me. In that moment, a plan began to form in my mind. It wasn't about revenge, not at first. It was about showing them that they were wrong, about proving that I wasn't the one who was weak. They had underestimated me, and now I would make sure they understood the truth. I would make them see the consequences of their own words, of their own actions. They couldn't take me for granted any longer. I left their house that night with a heavy heart, but also with a burning determination to make things right, not just for my baby, but for myself. I knew it would take time, but I had already started. The first step was to stop giving. It was time for them to face the reality of their situation. And they would. The following weeks were a blur. I kept my distance, avoided family gatherings, and tried to focus on my own family. But my parents didn't take kindly to my silence. They called more often, asking for help, for money, for assistance with their bills. But each time I told them I couldn't help. Things are tight on my end, I would say, carefully choosing my words. They didn't question it at first. But as the days went by, the urgency in their calls grew. I could hear the panic in their voices as the bills piled up, as the threats of disconnections loomed. And every time they asked for help, I reminded them of the truth they had once called my baby a burden. Now they were about to experience what it felt like to be burdened themselves. I watched as their world slowly began to crumble. The mortgage payment was missed. The utilities were about to be shut off. Their credit card payments were late, and the phone calls from creditors started to pour in. The weight of their actions was finally becoming clear. But I wasn't going to give in, not this time. The guilt I'd once felt for not being able to help them was slowly fading. I had been their silent provider for so long, sacrificing my own peace of mind to keep them comfortable. But now it was time for them to understand what it meant to live without help, without the cushion I'd been providing. And through all of this, I never stopped thinking about that one moment, the moment they called my baby a burden. It was that single, cutting remark that had ignited everything. It was the spark that started the fire. And now it was time for them to feel the heat. As I sat in the quiet of my own home, my baby asleep in my arms, I couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment. I wasn't the burden here. I had been carrying them for too long. Now the tables had turned, and soon they would realize just how much they had underestimated me. I was tired of being the silent provider. It was time for them to face the truth about their own actions. I would make sure they regretted calling my baby a burden. Little did they know, the money they took for granted was about to disappear, and their world would come crashing down. The days following that dreadful family gathering were filled with a quiet intensity. I had promised myself I would show my parents the consequences of their hurtful words, but that didn't mean I wasn't battling inner turmoil. I had never imagined I would be in this situation, plotting against my own family, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had no other choice. My mind raced, but my resolve was strong. I couldn't let them continue thinking they could walk all over me, that I would forever be the one holding up their world while they belittled mine. I had to stop giving them the financial support I had been offering in secret. The moment they realized they were on their own, their world would start to crumble. And I wanted to make sure they felt every bit of that collapse. The first step in my plan was to stop sending them money. This had been an unspoken agreement between us, but it had become clear that it was time to cut the cord. I didn't want to make it obvious at first. I needed them to feel the pinch gradually, to understand the consequences of their own careless words and actions. I began by not responding to their calls. For the first time in months, when my father called asking for help with his bills, I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. I did the same with my mother, even though her messages were filled with concern and panic. I wanted them to feel what it was like to be on the edge, to face the same desperation that they had made me feel when they called my child a burden. After a few days, the phone calls started to become more frequent, but I held my ground. They had to learn the hard way. I wasn't going to be their crutch anymore. When I did answer, I kept my responses short and impersonal. "I'm sorry, I can't help this time," I said to my mother when she called, her voice trembling with urgency. "I've got my own things to worry about." I could hear the confusion in her voice. But we've helped you so many times before. What's going on, sweetheart?" Her words stung, but they also solidified my decision. It wasn't just that they had hurt me with their words. It was that they had taken everything for granted. All those years, I had silently supported them, but when I needed their support, when I needed their love, they turned away. I wasn't going to keep giving when they didn't even appreciate it. The next step in my plan was subtle, but it would hit them harder than they could have imagined. I started to make small changes to the way I handled my finances. I tightened my own budget and ensured that I wasn't spending any extra money. But I also started to make subtle changes in how I managed my household, making sure they noticed the difference. A few weeks passed and I began to see the cracks form. My father called again, asking for help with his credit card payments. I don't know what's going on with the payments, but I've been getting calls from the bank. Can you help us out? I knew the moment had come. I knew they were beginning to feel the pressure, the financial strain that came from depending on someone else for everything. But I had made my decision long before this moment. I'm sorry, Dad, I said, keeping my tone steady. I really can't afford to help right now. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him sigh. You're not the only one going through hard times, you know? It was as though he was trying to guilt-trip me into helping. But I wasn't going to let him manipulate me anymore. I understand. But I've got my own issues to deal with. Maybe you can figure something out on your own, I said. Before hanging up. The relief I felt in that moment was overwhelming, but I didn't let it show. I had been living under their shadow for so long, quietly sacrificing my own peace for their comfort. But now I was taking control of my life. Now I was the one calling the shots. The next few days were filled with anxiety. I could sense that. They were starting to panic, but I couldn't bring myself to care. It was as if a switch had been flipped. I no longer felt responsible for them. They had crossed a line, and now it was time for them to learn what it felt like to be helpless. I started getting messages from my mother. She was more frantic now, her tone more desperate. Please, sweetheart, I know you're upset with us, but we really need your help. The utilities are about to be turned off. You can't just leave us like this. Her words dug into my chest, but I held strong. I had to. If I caved now, all of this would have been for nothing. I'm sorry, Mom. I really can't. You've got to handle this on your own. I'm sure you'll find a way. I could hear the sound of her sniffing, trying to hold back tears. I don't understand. You're our daughter. We've always been there for you. My heart shattered for a moment, but I couldn't give in. I've always been there for you too, but it's time you learn to stand on your own. I'm not your safety net anymore. Days turned into weeks, and the strain on their finances became impossible to ignore. My father had called me again, and this time his voice was more measured, as though he had finally realized that he couldn't guilt me into helping him. We're struggling, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. We've missed some payments, and I don't know what to do. We need you. For the first time, I could hear the crack in his voice, the desperation that I had been waiting for. But I didn't feel sympathy. I'd already come to terms with what was happening. I'm sorry, Dad. You need to figure this out. I've done enough. It was a harsh truth, but it was a necessary one. I needed them to understand that they couldn't keep taking advantage of me. They had used me for years, never acknowledging the sacrifices I had made for them. And now they were beginning to see how quickly everything could fall apart when they didn't have me to lean on. The weeks that followed were tense. I didn't hear from them as often, and when I did, it was clear they were trying to save face. They called, but it was always to talk about something trivial, a far cry from the desperate pleas for help I had once received. They were beginning to realize the truth. I wasn't there to rescue them anymore. I knew it wasn't over yet. They hadn't yet learned the full extent of what I had been doing for them all these months. But I could see it in their eyes when we met anxiety, confusion, and a dawning realization that they had taken me for granted for far too long. It wasn't enough just to stop helping. No, I needed them to see how fragile their world had been all along and how quickly it could crumble. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about making them realize that they were responsible for their own lives. They had been living in denial for too long, assuming that I would always be there to fix their problems, to clean up their messes. Now I was making them face the consequences of their actions. They had made my baby a burden, but now they were beginning to feel the weight of their own decisions.